everyone. My name is Chris Miller, and I am presenting today on a project funded by the National Science Foundation that I was involved with. We were a multidisciplinary team which originated at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. And our team, Elizabeth Hilt is our PI. Co-PIs, myself, Chris Miller, now with the Savannah College of Art and Design, Kelly Loss, Illinois Institute of Technology, and Eric Bray, now with the University of Texas at San Antonio. For most of this project, Stephanie Taylor was our research assistant. Stephanie is a PhD student in psychology. So just a quick overview of the project. The request for proposals came out a number of years ago, at least 5 years, well, probably 6 years ago. And it was called Cultivating Cultures for Ethical STEM. And this came under the Directorate for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences. And the main question which the grant was hoping to answer is they wanted to know what constitutes ethical STEM research and practice and which cultural and institutional contexts promote ethical STEM research and practice, and why. So this was our timeline in the years 1 and 2. We began with a benchmark survey. We followed with a comparative study of lab cultures by visiting each of the labs. We started a series of interviews, and we used the ESIT and source surveys. In year 2, we had grad student ethics committees. We had 2 of those, which we piloted as a potential alternative to traditional ethics education. We began coding and we were awarded a Faculty Innovation Award at IIT. And we also spoke with the departments about adopting the guidelines that the student committees proposed. In year 3, we designed a bottom-up ethics module, which was tested in the following year at the University of Texas with grad students. We are currently in year 5. We are continuing multi-coder coding using the coding that was originally done in MaxQDA. We are continuing with analysis, and we are preparing for a final workshop on building inclusive ethical cultures in STEM, and that will take place in April of 2021. So for our coding and analysis, there are 3 coders, myself, Kelly Loss, and Elizabeth Hilt, who independently coded interview responses. Then we met to negotiate and narrow down the coding and agreed on coding categories. And with regard to the definition of culture and lab culture, as a team, we identified a broad spectrum of subcodes. The subcodes for lab culture, interestingly, were much more complex than the ones for the definition of culture. So we are currently considering the definition of culture as providing a broader framework and a background for discussing lab culture. But we are particularly interested in lab culture. In our major coding categories from the interviews in lab culture, we had communication, community structure, collaboration, atmosphere, and governance. And they're in that order based on the number of codes and the frequency with which these coding categories appeared in the interviews. Now, just to be clear, we understand that lab culture is based on an understanding of cultures as the social climate and general character of a social environment or context where individuals interact. This is a combination of customs, practices, morals, attitudes, and behaviors. So again, what we saw in terms of the relationship between our high-level definition of culture, which we did explain to the interviewees in terms of the questions, the question that they were asked, we saw that what lab members said, and when they were asked about culture in their labs, reflected quite a sophisticated understanding of culture in general. And these, again, are the 5 major themes that have emerged through our coding. So quick definition of each of these. Our first code was actually communication, which had the highest frequency of codes. We defined communication as the exchange or transmission of information through spoken or written or even nonverbal means. Our second code was community structure in terms of frequency. We define this as the types, number, and roles of individuals in a particular environment and how those individuals relate to each other. Third, we looked at atmosphere as the next highest level of frequency, and we define atmosphere as the social climate, the general character of a social environment or context where individuals interact. And this is a combination of customs, morals, norms, attitudes, and behaviors. And finally, we saw that collaboration was a major subcategory. We define this as the process in which 2 or more people or entities engage in working together for a common purpose. And then last but not least was governance. And we define governance as the process of overseeing the way rules, norms, and actions by an authorized person or body manifest within a social group or organization. So moving on to our first code, our first major coding category, communication. Again, we see this as the exchange or transmission of information through spoken, written communication, or even nonverbal means. So we had the largest number of interview citations or excerpts that related to the quality of communication. So here is one of our interviewees explaining that they think that good communication is being direct and also being thoughtful to others, other person's feelings, and their kind of state of mind, their expectation, and you know where they are, I guess. I think feelings get lost a lot, especially in STEM fields. So I am more logical, focused and efficiency driven. Like I hadn't worked outside of STEM fields, so I really can't speak to that, but it does feel a bit like that gets left behind. And here he's referring to the kind of communication that comes from that has an affect, an emotional quality. And he's saying that, yeah, the quality of our communication is good, but from a perspective of engineering, I know I'm focused on efficiency. And maybe there's something else that we should be thinking about. So the next highest frequency, and again, as I explain these the sub codes and the categories, major code categories, these are excerpts, and they certainly don't cover our entire study, but again, starting with lab culture and what our interviewees had to say about that. So we found that in terms of frequency, verbal and nonverbal communication was the second highest subcode. And by this, they talked about the lab members communicate shared community, friendship, and sharing, which involves sharing details about professional life. So students mentioned that sharing their research and project results, but also getting to know each other better during conferences, or the ability or the inability to talk during their time in the lab where they may be focused exclusively on their work. or try to be. One student said, like, we try to put headsets and not be distracted or anything, but it's not always happening, but we talk. Sometimes we talk where we have lunch together sometimes. Also, verbal and nonverbal communication plays a huge role in how students feel about the lab. For example, so in our lab, the work environment is very nice. And although I've been here for a short time, my lab mates have treated me like friends from the very beginning, which is something that I really like. Like I feel integrated into it. Finally, it's not just working in the lab, but also about having a good time while working in the lab. That also plays a role. So continuing on with communication, our third highest frequency subcode was learning to communicate. So some students mentioned that it was difficult to talk with lab members about their work because everyone is working on something different, on a different project. Also, limited communication could lead to difficulties accomplishing a task. So one of our interviewees said that challenges were mostly technical. So just giving a task, maybe that didn't have all the information that I needed at first. So I have to search over it, search for it, and people related to this topic. Successes most of the time, we've been able to, but me personally, I have the similar people in my labs who have been able, as time goes on, to get the problem solved and get that going before the due date. Another excerpt, frequency of the subcode was communication and community building. So in this subcode, we found that communication involved things like connecting, helping each other, and sharing and creating a sense of community. So one student said, if people communicate better, we have very different people. I mean, different cultures in a lab. So it's also better if people communicate more often so we can know each other, even with people who come from all over the world, and we can get along pretty well. They also said that they thought that each member of the lab can themselves play a role. So for instance, one member said, lab culture in our labs, it looks like we can keep our difference, even though we come from so many places, we can be different and yet still communicate and get along as a community. Next was the tone of communication. And here we found that in the lab, we're all friends. Like we talk to each other regularly. We don't treat us very formal, like working relationships are formal. So even our PI, we refer to each other by first name. Another student said, I think we have a good interaction among each other, fairly comfortable with one another and not necessarily this notion of hierarchy. So I'm going to move on to number 5, which is also shared with previous tone of communication. In this one, students made comments about the mode of communication or how individuals communicate played a key role in how students described their understanding of culture in an abstract sense. So 3 of the 9 students that mentioned this as important said, for example, that the way we communicate, the way we express our feelings, like that. So next, finally, and this was our largest code, frequency of codes in this category of communication. The 6th was negotiation of meaning, which comprises aspects related to shared knowledge of methods, meaning of standards, and shared understanding of values. So while some students referred to lab meetings, others focused on how to communicate knowledge of lab member methods and standards. So one student said, so my professional and personal opinion is that even if you really do know and can figure out how to use, in our lab at least, a piece of equipment or know how to do a procedure, whether it's mixing chemicals or working on materials or working with equipment, just simply ask and learn how it's done. And then you can bring up your concerns later if you think it's wrong. Finally, the last subcode in this category was language. And we were surprised by this because It did not come up very often at all. And this was surprising in the sense that our lab members came from all over the world and came from very different cultures, spoke different languages, and yet language itself was not considered an important factor based on what we've heard in the interviews. So one student said, culture is defined by a lot, at least the way I understand it, a lot of different things, not only language or the type of education or the country, like it's all together, right? But in fact, you can have people from different cultures speaking the same language, at least the way I understand it. So that student went on to relate this to how it works in the lab environment. He said, but maybe the language is one of the parameters or one of the parts of culture that has the highest impact on the ongoing of lab or the lab experience or lab community. So we thought that was quite interesting. Important insight. Our next highest coding category was community structure. So we're switching to a different coding category here. And this is defined, we understand it as the types, number, and roles of individuals in a particular environment and how they relate to each other. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly and say just that we had the most frequency of code showing up in the group structure characteristics. And we found that many of the participants described the overall communication communication in their labs as being informal, organic, self-guided, free, relaxed, where they felt that these characteristics of communication also applied to the group structure, that it was informal, organic, self-guided, free, and relaxed. And the second highest frequency of codes came in terms of the size and composition of the labs. And this was both in terms of individuals working there, a combination of undergraduates, PhD students, and the fact that one of the students said, I do like how we have all three stages, undergraduate, master, and PhD, and all that, and that it was really cool. Another student commented that they were a very small lab, only 3 graduate students, and this person was the only undergrad. So they were all working very closely with the PI. And he thought that this made the lab very close, and that was a good thing. So also in this category, we saw that the process and practices were mentioned very frequently. So this would involve lab meetings and formal interactions. And referencing the lab meetings, one student said, I enjoy them a lot. I think we have a very good functionality as a lab group. The main structure that bridges us all is weekly meetings. And yeah, those weekly meetings in which we share what everybody is doing and update one another and maybe help each other. So another high frequency subcode in this category was structures that facilitate or impair collaboration. And here students talked about sharing information or not sharing information and being available to help one another. They were mentioned as positive factors. And students also mentioned that one of our students responded, first of all, the thing I noticed is teamwork. Teamwork is very good here. People really collaborate very well with each other. It's kind of, duty. When you are called upon to help here, if you ask a question, about my group, they run to you and really help you, give you information. And another high frequency subcode in this category had to do with ideas to improve community structure. So one student, when asked about how his lab could be improved, mentioned the need for more guidance. And several of our interviewees mentioned this. But in this case, he coupled it with a lack of collaboration. So he said, I don't really know how it could be integrated, but more of a discussion about he's talking here about the emotional challenges that are kind of present in our research, and we work mainly alone and without a lot of guidance. So it's easy to get lost. Okay, so moving on, our next coding category was community structure. And this refers to the types, number, and roles individuals in a particular environment play and how they relate to each other. So again, okay, so we're moving on now to collaboration, which we define as the process in which two or more people or entities engage in working together for a common purpose. So we saw that atmosphere was very important in this category. But more important than that were the practices, process, procedures, and factors to facilitate collaboration. So one of our students in regards to this said that they feel that being left alone in the name of learning to work independently was rather more of a problem, had an upside, but it also had a downside. So this person said that working along without help is the biggest problem. Also, we have told that this is how we become independent as a researcher, that's why we do this. Another high frequency subcode in this category was related to working relationships and dynamics of collaboration, including helping others. So one student said, I guess having a kind of open door policy if anyone is able to help and ask a question whenever they need to. Another student said, I think we have good interaction among each other. We're fairly comfortable with one another and not necessarily this notion of hierarchy. And there's also a good balance. I'm looking for, like, we work together well, trying to explain how he felt. Another high level subcode in this category was in the atmosphere, which was described as central for collaboration. Being a respected lab member, independently of one's cultural background, one's clothes, or political views, plays a positive role here, as well as working in a friendly, supportive atmosphere. So one student said, in regards to atmosphere, I think that the organic nature is great. It allows people's personalities to show what they are good at, or being able to step up and do things that they feel passionate towards. So another subcode here had to do with leadership, and leadership that supports or inhibits collaboration. So in this case, one student said, yeah, well, as we come to the lab the first day, my professor, he wants us to work together as much as we can. If people communicate better, we have very different people, different cultures in the lab. They also saw, in terms of inhibiting collaboration, that the distance between the head of the group or the advisor, supervisor, and members of the group is a major inhibitor of collaboration. Our next subcode in this category of collaboration is that factors that inhibit collaboration. In contrast to the positive aspects, we heard from our respondents that political influence or pressure, lack of resources, working alone, others not responding to emails, and lack of detailed documentation concerning methods and procedures were mentioned as factors hampering collaboration. One student said that working without help is the biggest problem. Also, we have been told that this is how we become independent as a researcher. The fifth highest frequency in the collaboration category was learning to collaborate. So one student said, I think we have good interaction with each other, fairly comfortable, and not necessarily this notion of hierarchy. He felt that they work together well. For helping each other, it proves useful that not every lab member works separately on their individual project, but that there is a certain overlap that allows for and requires exchange and mutual understanding. And all that is related to learning how to collaborate. Finally, in collaboration, we found that there were a lot of suggestions, or several suggestions. And one of those was from a interviewee that said, I think in our lab, especially, like we don't have a policy where there is no group working for one target or for one topic. Everyone is working on a different area. So we don't go and stay vertically in topics so everyone is on the same page. So everyone is working differently. And actually, I don't need to say or even 100% listen or know what my colleague is doing. And the same he will do for me. So you just focus on your research almost like you know what you will always have discussions. So this is one of the things that he felt perhaps could improve collaboration was like not having everyone work so independently. Okay, so finally, in terms of collaboration, our last code, which only got one mention, but we thought it was quite interesting, is that several interviewees stress that even though there's competition between students in the lab, they also help each other. So the student said, yeah, our environment is very competitive and also very friendly and very competitive. People help each other, but they compete too. That's productive. So here, changing to another major category, and this is atmosphere, which we understand as a social climate, the general character of the social environment or context where people interact. That is a combination of customs, morals, attitudes, and norms of behavior. So here, our number one frequency in subcodes was characterizing or describing atmosphere. And this was also, we noticed, involved formal or informal. So in terms of positive characterizations of the atmosphere in the lab, students referred to the atmosphere as informal, relaxed, trustful, friendly, competitive, and productive, supportive, social, organic. It provided freedom. Students were hardworking, friendly, and respectful. There was a chemistry of sharing, and the atmosphere was open and student focused. And in terms of negative characterization, we found that the atmosphere could be affected negatively by people complaining a lot, people who do not openly communicate, and that in fact the atmosphere was too relaxed. So our second highest code frequency in this category had to do with the activities or factors that shape the atmosphere. So here we found one interview sharing that protocols are in place for doing things as a factor that shape the environment, the atmosphere. It's kind of informal that we pass around scripts of how to handle certain things, submissions to computers, and all sorts of activities. So as far as other things like how data is managed and those sorts of things in the lab is very much being something that I have been asked to put together. So trying to get organized. We also saw as another subcode that teaching and learning, and here we saw a lot of reference to people who were self-taught and those who were responsible or felt inclined to help others. Several of the interviewees in this subcode mentioned or stressed that they learned from other lab members, or they taught other lab members and were attempting to teach others. And they often critically reflected on how an informal atmosphere and hands-off governance style left them with the feeling of being alone sometimes, and that the need to teach others and motivate themselves was very strong in that environment. So continuing with atmosphere, we found that the outcomes of the atmosphere, whether it was positive or negative, often came up in the interviews. So we found that one student shared that the culture in the lab can make all members in the lab feel very comfortable, like they want to go to work as an outcome of a positive atmosphere. However, another student said, I don't talk about it because it brings negative energy to you and to your lab mates. So if you are afraid of something and there's nothing for you to do, complaining about it doesn't help. So we saw that they talked about the outcomes of atmosphere as being both positive and negative. And then we also saw that the PI had a very strong effect on the atmosphere. And we found one student sharing that my PI is very helpful. However, it can also breed a culture of lesser work ethic than I have been exposed to in the past. So we see both the positive and negative effect, potential negative effect of leadership on the atmosphere. So next, we found that students talked about giving and receiving or asking for help. And in this case, a student shared that I could ask for help, no problem. I didn't want to bother him too much, referring to the grad student who was leading his lab. So a lot of time was spent self-teaching. And I think we are at the point where the lab has been through long enough and we have enough members that we are kind of able to help each other. So here the implication seems to be that the longer a group of students is together in the lab, they will self-organize in a way that they are able to help each other and ask and receive help. Finally, our last category was governance. And we understand governance as a set of processes for overseeing the way rules, norms, and actions by an authorized person or body operates in a particular environment. So we saw the first subcode that the code that received the highest frequency in the interviews was the PI's role in shaping governance. And this really made us sensitive to the fact that next major category is going to be the role of the PI in shaping lab culture in general and in shaping an ethical culture in the lab. But for this governance category, we found that the PI does play a crucial role in determining whether or not lab members have flexibility concerning their work hours, whether lab members collaborate with other researchers or with other labs. One student stressed that for new lab members, it's crucial to learn about the PI. And they said that I would say my advisor is more hands-off. So you're not going to be spoon-fed how to do your work or how to do things. So you help them understand that the advisor and help them understand the advisor and maybe help them get on their feet or get their feet wet a little bit. I thought that was interesting. And then the second, actual equally high frequency refers to criticism or implications of current governance. And here we found that students reflected critically on the implications of their lab's current governance style. Several stressed that freedom and independence comes with responsibility for one's projects and the progress of one's projects, with not being told in detail how to find answers to upcoming questions and problems. There are downsides going along with the informal governance style. For example, as we mentioned earlier, this quote from a student who said that, yeah, it's great that my advisor is so student focused and she really cares about us, but it's great to have this boss, but it can also breed a culture of lesser work ethic than I've been exposed to in the past. So while it was good, there was also a downside. Our second highest frequency subcodes had to do with hands-off versus and informal, and also the role of learning in the lab. Here we found that none of the students actually, in terms of whether a lab was hands-on or hands-off, they didn't talk about a hands-off informal lab very much. In terms of governance, in general, an informal governance style was characterized as fostering freedom, creativity, and efficiency, allowing flexible working hours and increasing motivation to work and develop stamina to find solutions to a problem. Next, in terms of subcodes, we found the role of learning played a very was very high in terms of frequency in our coding. So one student mentioned that when they were first starting off, it was a lot of self-taught because my lab professor was the only person I could really ask for help. I didn't want to bother him too much, so a lot of self-taught. And I think we are at the point where the lab has been there long enough and has enough members that we are kind of able to help each other. So another student went on to say that working alone without help is the biggest problem. Again, learning is self-taught. Also, we have been told this is how we become independent as researchers. I'd say it would be more efficient if we had some kind of working relationship with each other, like you always do this, and you can guide me to this, as you can help me to get it, instead of I should just learn everything from scratch. So they had a lot of comments about this. Finally, in terms of governance, our last subcode had to do with the atmosphere and how governance was related to atmosphere. And we saw that it had a lot to do with getting along and shared understandings about how things should be done within the lab. Then students also talked about atmosphere in terms of the mood, feelings such as being friendly, trusting, caring, respectful, and tolerant. Among characteristics and structures of government styles conducive to positive lab cultures, it was mentioned that accesses to resources 7 days a week, being able to come in whenever students were able to, no matter what time of day or day of the week. They said that collaborating with others and helping each other was very important to shaping the atmosphere and the governance, and that being free to work at one's own pace, good leadership was important, lab management was important, respectful behavior, and also regular lab meetings, presenting one's research to others, and regularly giving and receiving feedback. However, students also mentioned issues such as especially new members having difficulties learning new methods due to lack of support, lack of precise communication, or lab members not being fully aware of or appreciative of safety regulations associated with informal governance. So again, we found as a team and as coders that there were both pluses and minuses in terms of governance, that a weak governance or too informal a governance that lacked structure could create problems, especially for newcomers, in terms of understanding safety measures or how to do things. So moving on, we are now in the process of sorting through our insights to understand what really matters for lab culture, or in terms of lab culture, related to ethics. So that's our next steps as we continue analysis. And we're also using our analysis to inform the implications of the analysis to inform a design for the future and final deliverable. And also our major insight that raising awareness of the student perspective related to ethics as being different than the faculty orientation to ethics, which is very much about responsible conduct in research. So we thank you very much for your attention, and we would welcome questions. You can contact us at the emails that are provided at the beginning of this presentation, and we would certainly love to continue this conversation and happy to share with you our final analysis. And we would welcome you to participate in our final workshop, which was mentioned on our timeline. Thank you very much.